In this video, we'll try to understand challenges that you may face when using props to pass and receive data from parent components, especially in a deeply nested application. Props allow parent components to pass data to child components. They are easy to work with and simple to understand. In the last video, we understood the fact that React strongly affirms a one-way data architecture that relies on the use of props for passing data down to children. It is also important to note here that state must preferably reside at the nearest parent. This makes it easy to share this data with child components. And by parent, I don't mean the root component, but a logical parent which makes it easy to store and share data between its children. While this sounds like a simple idea, the real problem begins when we have a deeply nested application. Architecting data flow in a deeply nested application can be quite the challenge. And we are not talking about using a state management solution like Redux here, but instead we are talking about React's core architecture and data flow using props. Let's try to understand this through a diagram before we see some code. Here we have a pseudo tree of components. Our state in this case is situated right at the top of our application. From the app component, we get data using the name, title, and age props. This component is built up of two components, component 2 and component 3. While we need the name and title in component 3, we are simply passing the value of age down to component 4, the consumer, in our equation. I'm sure you're seeing the problem here. For the value of age to reach component 4, it must pass through component 1 and component 3 using props. This means that you must build and provision forwarding props in the intermediary components for the data to reach the consumer. If anything breaks in between, it can break the consumer component as well. This situation is popularly referred to as prop drilling. Not only do you have to be extra cautious when designing components, but you also have to consider and build a challenging data flow path that travels through deeply nested components to provide data to a component that sits right at the bottom of the hierarchy. For component 4 to work correctly, we must rely on the forwarding props on component 1 and 3 to receive data from the parent and pass it down to component 4 without consuming it itself. You basically keep forwarding props down the chain. Let's say at some point in time, component 4 was rebuilt and it no longer needs the age prop. Then you can end up with orphaned props on component 1 and component 3 and you'll need to refactor them out. Keeping track of all these props can be extremely daunting. Let's try to examine this problem in code. Begin by downloading and setting up the project from the link given here. We'll analyze this completed application which displays a bunch of restaurant cards with a set of details and a rating score. This is the kind of thing you see in food delivery apps. We also have a button which reveals offers if the restaurant provides one. The app itself is made up of a function component where we are consuming data from a static data source that you can see in the data folder. By using a state variable and the use effect hook, we are bringing in the data when the app component loads for the first time. Then we are simply mapping the array of data that we are getting to instances of the restaurant card component, passing data as individual props. The restaurant card component is made up of a details component and a score component. Since the details component requires data, we are simply forwarding props from the restaurant card component to the details component. On the other hand, it is the end of the road for the score prop as its data is consumed here by the score component. Now, the details component consumes some part of this data that came through our forwarded props but passes down the status and offer text props to their own respective components. The open or closed component displays the message open now or closed to inform the user if the restaurant is open or closed. On the other hand, the offer component displays a small button, clicking which displays any available offers that the restaurant may have put out. But I'm sure you can see prop drilling in action. What starts at the restaurant card level must be explicitly passed through the details component and finally through the open or closed and offer components. And this isn't a very deeply nested app. So imagine what would happen if this app were several components deep. Here's a graphical representation of how our data is traveling through a network of forwarded props. The fact that you must manually ensure that you have these props in place is reason enough to consider a refactor or come up with a better strategy for sharing data. We must find a better technique for sharing data with nested components. Now, you can reduce prop drilling to an extent by using patterns like render props and designing reusable components and basically redesigning the composition tree. But even then, the challenge associated with efficiently providing data from a parent that is high up the chain to a component that sits deeply nested within needs to be addressed. Fortunately for us, React provides us with the amazing Context API. Let's find out more about it in the next video.